Welcome to American History Lesson 32. A Conservative Age. Our lesson objectives are: identify how President Nixon enacted foreign and domestic policy, identify key political events that impacted the presidency during this time period, identify the impact the economy had on America, identify key events in the birth of the environmental movement. President Nixon at home and abroad. President Richard Nixon pushed conservative policies. President Nixon wanted to limit the power of the federal government by introducing revenue sharing. Revenue sharing allowed local and state governments more freedom to pass federal aid. Nixon wanted to reform social welfare, but his plan failed to pass Congress. At first, Nixon worked with Congress, which Democrats controlled. Soon, he refused to spend money voted by Congress on programs that he did not approve of. The Supreme Court ruled President Nixon's actions unconstitutional. President Nixon began a policy of law and order by enlisting the CIA and IRS to harass the liberals and dissidents that he considered his enemies. Nixon hoped to strengthen his political support to ensure his reelection. He tried to slow school integration, but the Supreme Court ordered the administration to move more quickly. He named conservatives to fill openings in the Supreme Court. A stagnant economy troubled the country. By 1973, the inflation rate had doubled, and the unemployment rate was up 50%. The causes were high spending on the Vietnam War, growing foreign competition, and the difficulty of finding jobs for millions of new workers. Another problem was a reduced supply and high prices for oil and gasoline. Nixon's efforts to lower prices did not work. Nixon dramatically changed U.S. relations with communist countries. He lessened Cold War tensions. In 1972, he visited communist China. This trip reversed past U.S. policy, which had refused to formally recognize the communist rulers there. 3 months later, Nixon visited the Soviet Union. These moves were widely popular among the American public. Along with the Soviets, he signed the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, SALT, which limited nuclear weapons. The foreign policy triumphs helped Nixon easily win re-election. Fun fact: as well as being the first president to visit communist China and the Soviet Union while in office, President Nixon was also the first president to visit all 50 states. President Nixon is also the first president to resign from office. His letter of resignation was as follows: Dear Mr. Secretary, I hereby resign the office of the President of the United States. Sincerely, Richard M. Nixon. The beginning of President Nixon's end. However, things would turn sour soon after. The Watergate scandal was caused by an illegal break-in and attempt to block the investigation of it. Nixon campaign aides were determined to win his re-election by any means necessary. They hired 5 men to raid Democratic Party offices in a Washington, D.C. complex called Watergate. Hoping to photograph files and place taps on phones, the men were caught. Rather than forcing those involved to resign, the administration tried to hide the link to the White House. The affair tested the idea that no one, not even the president, is above the law. After Nixon's re-election, the cover-up began to unravel. One of the burglars said that the White House was involved. Soon, 3 top Nixon aides who had been involved in the cover-ups resigned. In Senate hearings that were televised live, one of Nixon's aides said that Nixon had known of the cover-up. When it was revealed that White House meetings had been tape-recorded, the Senate committee demanded the tapes, but Nixon refused to turn them over. Court battles over the tapes lasted a year. In March 1974, a grand jury charged 7 Nixon aides with the obstruction of justice and perjury, or lying under oath. Nixon released more than 1,250 pages of taped conversations, but withheld conversations on some key dates. In July 1974, the Supreme Court ordered the White House to release all the tapes. 3 days later, a House committee voted to impeach President Nixon. If the full House approved, Nixon would go to trial in the Senate. If judged guilty, he would be removed from office. When the tapes were finally released, it was clear that Nixon had known of the cover-up. On August 8, 1974, he resigned. President Ford and Carter's impact on America. Succeeding Richard Nixon was Gerald Ford. Though likable and honest, Ford lost support when he pardoned Nixon. Ford faced a poor economy with prices rising 6 to 11% a year, fueled by sharp increases in the cost of foreign oil. His first program to halt inflation by encouraging energy conservation failed. When he pushed for high interest rates, a recession resulted. Ford ran for election in 1976 against Democrat Jimmy Carter. An outsider, not involved in Washington politics, Carter promised that he would never lie to Americans. He won a close election with this appealing message. Worried about the nation's reliance on imported oil, Carter believed that energy policy should be his top priority. The National Energy Act placed a tax on cars that had low gas mileage, removed price controls on domestic oil and natural gas, and funded research for new sources of energy. In 1979, however, another shutdown of oil imports plus high oil price hikes crippled the economy. Carter tried voluntary price freezes and spending cuts, but could not halt inflation. The economic problems of the 1970s were caused in part by changes in the economy. Greater automation meant fewer manufacturing jobs. Foreign competition cost American jobs too. Many companies were leaving the industrialized Northeast for the South and West to find low energy costs and less costly labor. In foreign policy, Carter tried to follow moral principles. He cut aid to countries that violated the rights of their people. He agreed to treaties with Panama that promised to give control of the Panama Canal to that country. He signed a new nuclear arms treaty with the Soviets called SALT-II. But when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union cooled and the treaty died. Carter arranged a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt while Muslim fundamentalists seized power in Iran. Angered at U.S. support for the former ruler, the Shah, they took control of the American embassy in Iran's capital and held 52 American hostages. Despite multiple diplomatic efforts, Carter could not obtain release of the hostages. They were held for 444 days, freed just minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated on January 20th, 1981 as the new president. The fight for our environment. Concern over the environment was spurred by the 1962 book Silent Spring. This book argued that pesticides were poisoning food and killing birds and fish. Awakened to this threat, the environmental movement took off on April 22, 1970, which is recognized as the first celebration of Earth Day. The day was marked by events aimed at raising awareness of environmental problems. President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. He signed the Clean Air Act, which required industry to take steps to reduce pollution from smokestacks and automobiles. Many other new laws to protect the environment were passed as well. When vast oil reserves were discovered in Alaska, oil companies built a huge pipeline to carry the oil to the sea. Nixon and Carter took steps to ensure that this industrial development did not harm Alaska's natural resources. Nuclear energy became the focus of a growing debate. Some felt it was safe and clean to utilize, while others feared nuclear accidents. A 1979 accident caused a Pennsylvania nuclear reactor to release radiation into the air. Afterwards, the government strengthened safety measures for nuclear plants. Some Americans opposed environmental laws. They argued that such laws protect wildlife at the expense of people and limited economic growth. The debate over the environmental law and their effect on business continues today. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses, straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.